Hey, what's up, Whippers? It's Vice here, and I thought I would recount to you how I went at the OCIC just gone past here in Australia, down in Melbourne. So, of course, as you all know, I've been testing quite a lot in the run-up to the event, and I gave a bit of an update through the community posts and shared the deck list and did a bit of a deck profile. But I thought what I'd do is just run through what my experience was at the event and let all of you in on a little bit of what the adventure was like for me, just so that you have an idea of what it might be like if you were to compete in an international event one day and what you might be able to expect if you were to attend one of those. So, look, the story starts months beforehand, to be honest, late last year. Something that I haven't really mentioned up until the last video I put out is I'm currently engaged to my partner. It happened not too long ago, late last year, and originally due to wanting to save money for things like the engagement party and the wedding and things like that, I didn't think that I would actually attend the international at all. Anybody who came up to me and asked me, so, hey, Vice, are you going to the international in February? I'd say no, because I thought I would need to start saving. But as it would happen, as we would start to plan and talk and try and figure out when's it all going to happen, it began to look a lot like going to the international in February was probably going to be a lot more feasible than trying to do it next year. So I thought, okay, well, I'll do the one this year, probably give the next one a miss. And so that's how it came to be that at almost the last minute, I decided, yeah, I'll sign up. And so I registered when they opened up registrations and then started planning and all that sort of thing. So look, I had a decent amount of time to work with before the event. I got to work trying to prepare. Although it's not an intentional thing, I think in years past, I've sort of assumed the identity of the person who just plays weird decks because I can. And if you're a regular viewer of this channel, you would probably assume that about me. I have this tendency to stray towards the weird and wonderful when it comes to Pokemon cards, right? So when you see a really unique deck pop up on your social media feed, maybe you're looking at Twitter or another content creator shares a weird deck or somebody does well at an event, you might think this would be a deck that they would probably play, and they, in that scenario, would be me. That's what people think of me, at least around here. So, it's an identity that I'm totally fine with. Something you sort of realize over years of playing the game is that you sort of just have to set your own goals when it comes to playing the game and with how you perform, right? So if your only goal with the game is to come first place every time, awesome. That's great. More power to you. But you've also got to be able to temper that expectation with a willingness to do what it takes to compete at a high level. And so what I'm sort of insinuating with that is that if you want to get first place every single time, then you need to be willing to play the best decks to achieve that. And playing the weird and wacky decks isn't really going to achieve that for you every single time. So, I sort of understand it, right? The mindset needed to try and play at that high level. I've qualified for Worlds in years past, and many times competing at the highest level necessitates approaching the game in a way that might be at odds with the way you might experience it in a casual setting. So all of that is to say, often it's time to put down the fun decks and focus on the tournament winners, right? Despite knowing this, I went ahead and put together an Orbeetle Braviary deck to get started with testing. So Orbeetle VMAX has been around for a while, and recently we saw a new Hisuian Braviary card released, and that card offers a kind of novel approach to an archetype that's otherwise been pretty well forgotten in recent years. So spreading damage counters is not something you've seen around for a while, and this deck does it for a 0 energy cost, which is very appealing. I tried my hand at crafting a strategy around the two cards, even being bold enough to enter an online tournament with the best rendition I could come up with at the time, and experience failure enough and you'll eventually move on to the next idea. And so that's what I would eventually do. I do have a tendency to stick with ideas for longer than people might bother. Perhaps much to the chagrin of my regular stream viewers, or maybe they enjoy watching my spiral into madness as I refuse to give up. I don't know. Look, a lesson I've learned in the lead up to this event has been that when it comes to crafting an effective Pokemon TCG deck, one of the rules of thumb should be that you shouldn't have to struggle or fight against the deck to get it to do what you want it to do or envisage that it should do. Okay, so when I realized that I was fighting too hard to execute a game state or an idea, that's sort of when I decided to put it down and move on. Okay, so after I experienced way too many failures with playing Orbeetle, I needed to look for other ideas. I started to toy around with the idea of developing a Zoroark list, so you all might recognize the Stage 1 Zoroark and Phantom Transform into a bunch of different Pokemon. I also put together the Rayquaza Lost Box deck in the interim before the release of Crown Zenith as well, after some pretty impressive results with that iteration of Lost Box were posted by a bunch of players. I think Pablo Meza did really well, got a top 8 at a big regional championship with the archetype and sort of put it on the map, okay? So Rayquaza was pretty impressive, seemed very effortlessly strong in testing, and then, sort of moved forward a little bit in time, and we saw the release of Crown Zenith. I started to test some new ideas around Zacian and Zamazenta. So first of all, I tried developing a quad Zamazenta deck, which, as the name implies, runs 4 Zamazenta and not a lot else to get it going. The idea was to rely on the strength of Zamazenta as an individual card, and it only gives up 1 prize, so that's like another really appealing part of it too. So it's strong and it can be supported in a way that's reminiscent of an archetype that inspired it from about 10 years ago called the Quad Terrakion deck. I would later concede to needing Bronzong in the deck as well. Even though it seemed pretty good, it began to fall into that fighting too hard to set up basket, so I sort of put it down and moved on. And the other deck that I tested as well, Zacian strategy that used the Berserker to boost the damage output. So the low energy on the Zacian was really appealing, and of course Berserker boosts that damage up. And the effect on the attack as well, going through things like Flying Pikachu's damage prevention from basic Pokemon was really appealing, but in practice it sort of required too much effort for too little of a reward as well. In the midst of all that, I was also experimenting with different Lost Box approaches. I even tried a heavy Kyogre Frostmoth build, which seemed quite interesting at first, but it was a bit unwieldy in practice, so I gave that up as well. During that time, I started hearing stories about a Cherrim Snorlax deck making waves after it appeared on stream at an event. I hadn't watched the match that sort of put the spotlight on it at first, but I sort of kept it in the back of my mind anyhow. And then when I saw a list crop up on Twitter with the claim that it was the play for Orlando, I decided to put the list together myself. And I gotta tell you, I was pretty smitten with the idea of the deck. It was simple, it was powerful. I played like 2 games and I was like, okay, this is it. I'm going to play this for the OCIC no matter what. It just seemed right up my alley. I was really keen. So I had about 3 weeks to play, to test the deck, make tweaks, all that kind of thing. I sort of finally settled on an archetype with a cohesive, sensible, powerful strategy. I was pretty sure I had all the time that I needed to get comfortable and develop game plans and all that sort of thing. What would follow is about a 2-week slow descent into madness with the deck. Every night, I would test online into the late hours. I would tweak, I would test, I would tweak. I'd want more from the deck. I would become doubtful about certain matchups. I was experiencing all those negative feelings that put me off all the decks that I'd rattled off before that I'd tried and tested and failed with. One night after finishing stream, I just gave it some thought, right? And one of the most difficult aspects about Cherrim and Snorlax together is having to manage the resources and with particular the energy. So it got me thinking that instead of utilizing Cherrim, I could just look to Flaaffy as an energy accelerator. So the theory seemed to hold. Once I began to test the idea, I was able to more aggressively pitch the energy, discard it with Quick Ball or use Greninja's ability. It became a great target for those, cards and effects and stuff, even Serena as well. I was able to draw aggressively, and the flow of the deck just seemed to work. So I had a little bit of time left. I tested as much as I could. Despite mitigating the resource management issues with Cherrim, even Flaaffy would give me some issues at times, So sometimes I would really just wanted to add Pokemon to my hand. Sometimes I just wanted energy in my hand. And so, Flaaffy is a single prize deck, right? You want to try and get as much mileage as you can out of every single card. And you've got plenty of turns to do it because you're only giving up one prize a turn, right? So instead of discarding and drawing 7 cards as you do with Professor's Research, sometimes I just wanted energy. Sometimes I just wanted Pokemon. And with a deck like this, it's a single prize deck, you want to try and get as much mileage as you can out of each card instead of just discarding and drawing 7 cards every single time. One of the resources you have is the prizes your opponent has remaining to take. You can take advantage of that. Okay, you've got extra turns that other decks don't. You can trade prizes in exchange for the setup time, provided that your board becomes resilient enough to make up for the prizes lost. Given this line of thought, I decided to turn to a supporter that was released early, but seldom used in the metagame, and that's Sonia. Okay, released in Rebel Clash, I believe. So this card fit what I wanted. It could help me maintain the resources I needed early. In the mid to late game, it could help me fish out energy or even replacement Pokemon to finish the game out with. So the rest of the week was a sprint to develop the best list, lots of small tweaks, racing around to try and gather the cards I needed. Wednesday rolled around and I had one last day to do some final testing, thinking about the last few Pokemon I wanted to include, how the trainer line needed to look, and then I packed my bags and I went to bed. Closed for a few days, my main deck and the Rayquaza Lost Box just in case, a bunch of staples and spares, a binder, and my Switch Lite, all packed and ready to go. So Thursday comes along and it's the beginning of my travel. I needed to be up somewhat early to get ready to head to the airport and catch my flight to Melbourne. So from my home state of Queensland, it's a pretty short flight, about 2 hours south, across New South Wales and into Victoria, landing at Tullamarine Airport in Melbourne. So fairly uneventful. I played a bunch of Super Mario Sunshine on my Switch Lite. It seems to be the game that I play whenever I'm traveling, and I'll slowly get there and finish that game. After I landed and meeting with one of my testing partners at Melbourne Airport, we head out and we catch what's called the Sky Bus to the city. So it's like this bus that connects you to from the airport to the city or wherever you're going. Pretty common to catch it, pretty common sight. Once I'm there, I meet up with another testing partner who is the person I'm rooming with for the event, and we head to our accommodation in South Bank on the other side of the river. I'm going to take a minute and talk about our accommodation because it was something. It was certainly one of the places to stay of all time. So, like I mentioned, I needed to do at least some things to try and do it on the cheap and save some money. So I was keen to split accommodation with somebody and just sort of take the cheapest option that was reasonable. Ours kind of demonstrated that you sort of get what you pay for. And I'll just go through it. So first of all, there was no reception. We just had to obtain the fob token that let us through the front door and into our room by punching a code into the lockbox that was sitting on the outside of the building. It was a bit weird. They gave us like a PIN number and you put it in and it sort of dispenses it. And then once we were into the building, there's an elevator. We got into the elevator, and this elevator was really weird. It just it didn't have a fourth wall where you would normally expect the door to be. So when you think about going into an elevator, there's like 3 walls and then the door that shuts. And that door just simply wasn't there. Okay, the way you got into the elevator is there was a glass door that you opened and you let yourself in, and then the door closes. Okay, and so as the elevator ascends, the elevator shaft is right here. Right? So it's not like there was a gap to fall into or anything. The elevator was right against the wall. And we just had to sort of watch as like the elevator shaft passed us by as we were going up in the elevator. It sounds weird, but basically the wall of the shaft is completely exposed to us. And my friend who I was rooming with, my testing partner, he put his hand out to be like, you could just touch the wall. And then because they broke the laser, I guess that detects when people are walking through and whatnot, the whole elevator just stops really suddenly, and we scared ourselves by doing that. Let me tell you, it took like a few seconds of taking your hand away, and then it sort of went, okay, there's nothing in the way now, and kept ascending up to our floor. So that was weird. I'd never been in an elevator like that. Very, very odd. We walk out of the elevator and head down the hall to our room, and that already seemed a bit dodgy because the floor seemed to shift. I don't really know how to describe it, but it was like walking on a wooden floor that was it seemed to shift with our weight as we walked along it, which was a bit worrying. And then, we got into our room finally, and the room looked okay at first, right? There was, clean towels and bed sheets and stuff. But then you start getting into it, right? The bathroom towel rack was half broken. Okay, it was sort of like half hanging off the wall, and the vent for steam in the bathroom was like mega dusty, and there was these little rat poison devices in the corner of the room. They had like these little messages on them that said like, keep out of reach of children and pets, but you've got it in the corner of a room where presumably kids could be staying with a family in this room, right? You'd normally see that kind of thing in like a warehouse, not accommodation, but there you go. So look, nonetheless, we settled in, and then it was time to head to the venue to check in. So competitor check-in is something that happens the night before a large event like the OCIC, presumably to help tournament organizers to figure out ahead of time who are present and who will be a no-show. And then they'll also hand out what you'll receive for participating as well. So it's a process that involves getting in line, being called over when it's your turn, to give your name and pop ID to a staff member. There'll be a judge for the event usually, and you'll receive your competitor goodie bag, which included a playmat, sleeves, deck box, a hat, a pin, and your badge, which denotes you as a participant, or you might get a spectator one if you're spectating, or what have you. And they're required to enter the venue on any of the days that it's open for play. So we had our goodies in hand. We and a few others who met up at the check-in decided to head to a nearby restaurant along the river, and we had sort of a nice dinner there before we decided to turn in. Once back at our accommodation, I took one last look at my deck and had a couple of decisions to make. Thinking about my testing, although I really liked Sonia, I also felt that 4 copies of Sonia was too many. Just enough copies is sort of what you need in order to make room for other cards to cover off other situations when you're deck building, right? So I decided to reduce the number of Sonia to 3 in order to make room for a Ditto. So in testing, I felt like I was perhaps 1 attacker too short, and Ditto was sort of the perfect answer to that conundrum. It gave me a 4th Thumping Snore, another Psychic Assault, another Wild Shock. Finally, I sort of decided that the last choice I needed to make was between running 1 Bird Keeper and 3 Escape Rope, or an even split of 2. So I left it to a group of friends to almost coin flip and let them decide for me what I was going to play. And the first suggestion was to go with the extra Bird Keeper. And the reason that decision is important or not, you wouldn't think there's very much to think about there, but the extra Bird Keeper is there for consistency. The extra Escape Rope assists to deal with things like Ice Cube and Flying Pikachu. The day of the tournament arrives. I get to the venue with the mission of at least drinking a coffee before the tournament starts, so I'm very thankful that the close by cafe inside the convention center and Food Mart nearby were sort of always there and available for me. I was able to get a coffee before it all started at about 8 a.m. I walked around, said hello to a few people, and before very long, it was already time to sit down and play. So I'll start going through what my tournament run was like now and give you an idea of what I played against and how it all went. So Round 1 is against one of the two matchups I felt I needed to avoid at all costs. Wouldn't you know it, Drapion VMAX might usually be a reasonable matchup for a standard Lightning box deck, but I tend to struggle. The colossal HP, the prize denial of Cherrim's Care, the healing, and just enough switching meant that I sort of went down in short order. Double Parasol also cuts off the paralysis from Wild Shock as a tool to deal with it as well, so pretty difficult. Not to mention I'm running Twin Energy, so those sort of get knocked out by Duraludon's ability as well, so pretty tricky. I was dejected, but still hopeful, you know. It's a pretty long event. One loss isn't the end of the world. Move on to round 2. Round 2, I played against a Canberra-based player, Tate, and their Lost Box deck featuring Zamazenta and double Sableye. So, although I lost game 1, I felt I learned a lot about how to approach the matchup, and I sort of came up with a game plan in my head of how to try and take at least a draw, if not a win, going into game 2. So much of it comes down to being careful with what you bench and being able to play with just one Flaaffy if you have to, which thankfully with Snorlax, when you think about it, it's got that fantastic ability, which means that Sableye is not putting down a bunch of damage counters and what have you. But in game 2, very unfortunately, I opened with Drapion V, and that gifted my opponent a pretty easy 2-prize KO as the game went on. I began the day at 0 and 2, and that is about as bad as it gets. I was a bit bummed out. All of my testing was looking like it was amounting to very little at the end, but as I lamented in my group chat with a bunch of my friends, I sort of remembered that hope wasn't necessarily lost. So on the one hand, I was still technically able to make day 2, with the cutoff being at 6 wins, 2 losses, and a draw, right? On the other hand, missing day 2 also didn't exclude me from earning championship points, so it was well worth fighting for in Swiss. You know, even if I hit that 3-loss point, still worth fighting for. Round 3 comes up, and I'm up against another Lost Box deck. Yikes. It was a rough start, and I lost the first game, but then I was able to run back a very quick game 2. My opponent's deck was one that made use of several V Pokemon, like Dragonite V, Raikou V, and then in game 3, my opponent opened with Lumineon V, and that opened a pathway for me to win, as Snorlax is able to make short work of Lumineon. It was a small victory, and I really needed to turn my day around, so I'm really happy I was able to pick that one up. There was no need to really think about the result I needed at the end of the day. I just needed to take things one step at a time. Now, round 4 was against a Japanese competitor, my first international opponent of the event. They played Mew VMAX, which is a matchup I'm very confident in. However close it can be sometimes, it can be a lot closer than you think. The two things that go in my favor, of course, is Drapion V's overwhelming ability to take 3 prizes against Mew VMAX, and Snorlax's HP being far too high for them to attack into with something like Energy Leap, right? Snorlax's attacks are also so strong that Oricoro's damage reduction is only relevant in situations when I'm trying to one-hit KO a Mew V or a Genesect V. All that being said, I was able to take down my opponent easily enough, especially given their deck didn't seem to include Path to the Peak, or at least they never seemed to play it down against me, so very thankful that I had a fairly casual 4th round. In round 5, I played against my first Lugia deck of the day. It seemed a bit odd that it took this many rounds to play against Lugia, but there you go. The deck very much resembled the standard Lugia deck that you'd run into on the ladder. I took a loss in game 1, while in game 2, I was able to stave them off and force a concession as they were forced to discard too many energy. In game 3, I took down a Stoutland V mid-game with a choice-belted Snorlax. Later, they used a Roxanne, and I discarded a Twin Energy with Greninja to hit another Snorlax. I powered it up with 3 Dynamotor ability uses to finish off a damaged Pokemon late game for the win. Round 6, I was up against another Mew VMAX player. It went very similar to round 4. The only thing sort of worth noting is that they drew very poorly in game 2, which seems like a really rare occurrence when it comes to Mew. Round 7, I played against Durant, piloted by the player who made top 8 at Brisbane Regionals a few months ago with Durant. I thought this was where the run would end, to be honest, as the right approach to Durant would create a very difficult board for me to maneuver. But in actuality, as I was playing a list with very many switching outs and a main attacker that could one-hit KO Durant even with a cape attached, it actually wasn't too bad. I will say that I was able to convert a probable draw into a win by playing quickly towards the end of the round, and that my opponent and I weren't sort of clearly able to hear end of time being called, so several turns probably passed before we were sort of informed or made aware of it. My opponent was really good about it, and they sort of understood that they needed a win just as much as I did, and they would rather play for the win rather than a draw, so their pace of play was pretty quick as well. I just want to say to my opponent, if you happen to watch this for whatever reason, I really appreciated the positive attitude you had about it, despite it being a run-ender. You are genuinely a good human being, so best of luck to you in future tournaments. I hope you get a chance to run it back with Durant. So cool. One thing I'd like to note about the round, though, sort of an interesting thing happened right at the end. I did a double coin flip for Snorlax's Thumping Snore, and one of the coins, well, the dice rather, one of the die fell on the ground, so I picked it up and I rolled it individually. And I think that a judge walked over and saw me roll a die individually on that turn, and they sort of interpreted it as maybe we were trying to roll to see who won the round. I had to sort of explain, okay, this die fell on the ground and I'm rolling it, and they were like, well, you know, the sleep flip requires two, and I said, well, you know, I already rolled one and this one fell on the ground, so I picked it up and rolled it individually, and that seemed to be a good enough explanation. But I understood what why they were quizzing us about it, because of course you may not determine the outcome of a game using a randomized method like a die or a coin flip. So, important one to remember, it is against the rules. Don't do it. In round 8, I had another international player in Aiden who was piloting Lugia. So, although I didn't know it at the time, Aiden has seen international championship success before with a top 16 finish in last year's North American International Championship. We sat down to play. Aiden opens Raikou and didn't bench a Lugia before ending their first turn. This game should be a slam dunk at this point, you know? Being unable to bench a Lugia on the first turn delays the rest of the game massively for them. And I was feeling pretty confident as I began to set up, right? But the game did start getting awkward. I sort of stumbled at different moments, and I wasn't able to land big KOs when I really needed to land them. We ended up playing a very long game 1 as a result, and eventually they won. So what I needed to do at this point was at least clutch out a game in response in the time remaining, and I think given my overall pace of play over the course of the tournament, it was pretty doable. I hadn't drawn yet at this point. So unfortunately, in game 2, I prized both Manaphy and Heavy Ball. Maybe because it had been a long day, I wasn't sort of properly checking my prizes, and because I was also trying to play a bit quicker as well, could be part of that as well. I unfortunately handed my opponent a really easy knockout with Raikou on a Flaaffy and a Mareep as a result, and it sort of left me stranded with a no energy board, and it very quickly turned into a losing position because I couldn't respond to the Raikou in time. It became pretty much impossible for me to play out of there. So, at that point, I was 5-3. I was out of contention for day 2. Given my atrocious start, though, I'm not really disappointed, but it was kind of bittersweet to make that run that I did with the oddball deck that I ended up submitting and stumbled at the finish line. That's how it goes sometimes, though. If I'd converted a win there against Aiden, I was just a draw away from day 2. Round 9 starts, and my opponent is piloting Regigigas. It's a matchup that I was pretty comfortable with. It's pretty straightforward. It's just a slugfest back and forth. Both players trade KOs until somebody wins. The only time it can get a bit awkward is if you don't have a Manaphy in play and their Regieleki gets to dole out 40 damage snipes to the bench. So it's pretty important not to let my opponent engineer a turn where they get to take multiple prizes as a result. Fortunately, in both games, I was able to take the first KO and dictate the pace of the game until I won 2-0. So, look, that's it. Swiss was a bit of a roller coaster for me, and despite not making it to day 2, I still finished with what was a pretty respectable 6-3. I was just a draw away from making day 2, but I was just happy that I made very few gameplay errors and that I managed to avoid getting any ties. The rest of the weekend was a bit more relaxed as well. I was able to spend time playing my deck in the side events, which I really enjoyed. I got to earn tickets to get prizes from the prize wall. I got one down here, actually. I won this Ditto, which is pretty cool. I won this Ditto because my partner said, you need to come back with something for me. So I got this Ditto plushie. And of course, Ditto made its way into my deck, so I thought I got to have that. I got to cop that Ditto. My opponents in these small 8-person tournaments had Mew and Lugia for the most part, so I was pretty comfortable in those. I was able to win 2 of the 3 that I played in. I did try to win a winner box tournament as well, which had a bit of a higher entry fee as well, but I lost in the first round of that. So these tournaments can be pretty volatile. They're all a best of 1, so you just gotta go with the flow, and if you lose, well, them's the breaks. Not much you can do about it. I spent some time playing the pack battle format as well, which at OCIC you sort of make a deck using a booster pack and 10 energies to make a 20-card deck. And there's a bunch of other rules that let you evolve Pokemon into other Pokemon and things like that. It's a pretty fun format with the current iteration using the 20-card deck rule, making it a bit more balanced, because before you could just make a 10-card deck using any amount of cards that you got from your booster, and you could just end up with some very imbalanced decks as a result. So pretty cool. From the prize wall, I also grabbed another deck box, and I also grabbed a Soaring Storm theme deck for myself as well. As you know, Soaring Storm is one of the best theme decks from PTCGO, and I felt like because it had done so much for my YouTube channel, I had to grab a physical copy of that too. So really happy to pick up one of those. Other than that, the rest of the event was just spent catching up with whoever I ran into and watching games play out on the big screen between it all. Pretty cool to see the names that you read about and watch on screen physically be at the event and walk around right in front of you. And so, after missing the 2020 Oceanic International because of COVID and other financial responsibilities I had at the time, it was really great to come back and compete alongside the world's best again. Although the points I earned put me halfway to a World Championship invite, I'm not sure I'll be competing for the rest of the season. I missed points in Brisbane, and I sort of don't plan on traveling to Perth. That only leaves one other opportunity to earn my invite, which is in Sydney in New South Wales. Pretty tall order, pretty unrealistic to think that I'd be able to earn the points required from just one event. So, look, if I did intend to travel to that event, if I changed my mind for whatever reason, I would just be going down for the sake of competition and trying to put my name out there and trying to win. I wouldn't be putting pressure on myself to earn the invite because it's pretty unrealistic off one event. I'll wrap up this video by saying the important lesson to take away from my preparation and performance is that while it's possible to bring something unique to the event and do well, it can't be a deck that's developed in a vacuum. You have to be aware of and testing against what the likely decks are out there and the decks that you think that you'll face in an event, and be satisfied that whatever you build is competitive against those. So good deck building is kind of like being good at conversation. You have to be able to listen, and you've got to reply in kind. So with that being said, thank you for listening to my tournament report. I hope you enjoyed it, and I'll see you in the next live stream or video. Take care, and goodbye for now. See you later.